Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's first Authors at Google Talk. Today, I'm pleased to welcome William Poy Lee, a local Bay Area writer. William is here to discuss his memoir, The Eighth Promise, an American son's tribute to his Toisanese mother, which chronicles his mother's journey to California, as well as his experiences growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown and the changing political tides. Told in two voices, this is an exquisite and unusual view of both the immigration and assimilation experience, end of a clan sisterhood who taught and protected women, made the cheese soups that kept everyone healthy and healed postpartum mothers, and transplanted those traditions to America. Alice Walker raves that this is a rare book that tells a story we have not heard before, yet poses questions that are eternal. After the talk, we'll follow with a Q&A session, so please feel free to line up at that mic over there and to ask any questions. With that, I'd like to introduce William Poy Lee.
First of all, thanks everyone for coming. I'm just wondering if we could all pull a little closer, because this will be a little bit more of an intimacy. Can we do that? People just in the back rows sort of move forward a little bit. And if you need to leave, and even if you're sitting in front, that's okay. I understand that people have things to do. First of all, I want to thank Ariel for arranging this, and for Erica and Julie for also helping. It's fun to be here. It reminds me of when I was in college, so it's a great feeling. In case you're wondering what these jackets are here, let me just explain a little bit. This summer is actually the 40th anniversary of the first modern Chinese-American Civil Rights March along Grant Avenue. It happened in '68. At that time, I was a precocious 17-year-old who spent too much time at City Lights reading books like Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin, Man-Child in the Promised Land by Claude Brown, and the autobiography of Malcolm X. And of course, Martin Luther King was marching in the South and talking about ending racism and Jim Crow. And there I was in my bedroom looking down Broadway Street at the new topless bars popping up and the cover band of Beatles songs and going, you know what? I think that Chinese Americans have had the same problem in California. And in fact, we have a Jim Crow society. We have a Chinatown that runs itself. We can't be policemen or firemen. We can be teachers, but not principals in schools, for example. Maybe it's time we asserted ourselves. And coincidental with that, of course, there was the rise of the Black Panthers, and SNCC had turned from nonviolence into Black Power. And there were a lot of people in Chinatown who were feeling the same way. And so when I look back and I think of the people in Chinatown in '68, it looked to me like we had the beginnings of what we can now call an intifada, which is a low-grade resistance against established authority. And these were essentially the uniforms of the militia. So I'm going to explain them to you. These people were activists from UC Berkeley, and they tended to identify a lot with Chairman Mao and the Cultural Revolution, and they were always waving these little red books. Of course, they had Mao buttons, and there was a text called Fan Shen, which purported to be the magical transformation of a backward village into the new socialist society. So that was quite popular. Along with that, they were very political. This is a Defend the Park button. People's Park was big, and it sort of symbolized the indifference of the university towards a lot of things, more involved with rights and property rights than human rights. This button is called the Asian American Political Alliance, and very interesting. They actually spent like a whole day at a convention redefining what to call ourselves. At that point, we were called Orientals, and a lot of us really didn't like that. They kind of smacked of Fu Manchu and Charlie Chin and all that kind of stuff. And of course, we know that Negroes redefined themselves as African Americans and blacks. Chicanos turned that word around into a positive. Native Americans were called Reds, and they chose to be called Native Americans. So the debate was, do we want to be called Amerasian, which was the other favorite, or Asian American? And ultimately, Asian American won, and that's why in a lot of forums now, when you are asked to check off your ethnicity, if you would be so kind, it says Asian American, and now Asian American Political Pacific Islander. So these were the leftists from Berkeley. These are the State College kids of San Francisco. A lot of them were Vietnam vets. This is an authentic Vietnam vet army jacket. And a lot of them fought in the war and became disillusioned. And they came back and they were wearing peace buttons and also buttons that said, say yes or no, I'm tired of BS. And a lot of them identified with like Cesar Chavez and his United Farm Workers. So here's a button called the Grapes of Wrath, Delano, which was their headquarters at the UFW. But a lot of us also went to like Winterland and the Fillmore, and we listened to bands like Grateful Dead. This is a flyer for Big Brother, and if you know your music, Big Brother was the backup band for Janis Joplin, and also the Charlatans is listed on this one. So there was this whole rock and roll and revolution thing, and of course what we used to call what's now called hooking up, but we used to call it free sex. So there's a button here that says, if it moves, fondle it. Yeah, right. Pre-AIDS, pre-everything. And then something in Suchian called Curse You Red Baron. You probably have to have read Peanuts and understand what that was to reference that. So these were the more politicized people. They eventually moved into the ethnic studies strikes, which resulted in the creation of Asian American studies, Black studies, Chicano studies, and so on. Now these were different. These were foreign-born kids who were delinquents, and we were trying to create programs to get them off the streets. They were called Wah Ching. And I don't know if you remember a movie called Superfly. Anyway, they kind of like dressing like that, very colorful, very Google colors, as I can see now. And then the other ones were the American-born delinquents, and they grew up in the projects. We called it the Pings. I'm a Ping kid. I grew up in a housing project, and I went to public high school called Galileo, and this is a graduating button. This is my class year. And they came up with two buttons, one called Yellow Peril, because anytime the Chinese had tried to organize in America, we were called the Yellow Peril, and we had to be dealt with and suppressed. And there is actually a book called Driven Out by Gene Pfizer, which I think documents that very well. If not for that, California actually would be very much like Hawaii. It'd be pretty well integrated financially and politically. And they also have a button called Unity, because they really were for unity. It's amazing that in those days, delinquent kids would actually organize in '67 and into a 501c3 and to try to change things. So this is simmering. So we came along and tried to do a nonviolent civil rights march to try to change the situation. So I'd like to read to you what that looked like. It was against this polarizing backdrop that I finally threw in my lot with the liberal activists who convened at the Opicolos Cafe to organize the first Chinese-American civil rights march along Grant Avenue. Perhaps we could keep the lid on, change the community without violence. At that time, Grant Avenue was best known to America as a stage set for Flower Drum Song, a popular 1960s musical portraying Chinatown as a sunny, halcyon, middle-class dream of a shiny, smiling, singing, and tap-dancing motto minority. We expected the street to be filled with American-born Chinese, or ABCs as we called them, visiting from the suburbs and tourists that sunny Saturday, and we were not disappointed. A lively group of around 40 of us filed onto Grant Avenue. Other demonstrators waiting along the route quickly swelled our ranks to 100 marchers and close to 200. Our boldly lettered bilingual picket signs blared our aspirations for equality for Chinese Americans, long overdue representation at City Hall, declaring that after all, we had been here for over a century. Others made specific demands: fair, decent minimum wage for Chinatown workers and adequate education programs. Several directly attacked the establishment, the Chinese six companies. Chinatown is a picturesque slum. And then I saw the old-timers. They had turned out to watch us, these old men of another generation who had lived under the six companies regime. Gathered in clumps of 2, 3, or 5, they idle curiously on street corners and in entryways or hunched over the ornate balconies of association headquarters. They tried to appear nonchalant, but as we marched block after block, they seemed to number in the hundreds, watching us in silent amazement with the neutral body postures they had learned to wear, like the drab suits they put on in the morning to sip safely through another day. These were not the well-fed leadership, but the bent, wiry wage earners, the survivors. I had expected them to boycott the march, but at that moment, I felt our connection. They had built this Chinatown for us, their next generation. They knew we were picking up the long dormant fight for full acceptance in America. Walking tall already, I stretched my spine higher for them and chanted louder for them, as if reimbursing them for their quiet, shuffling dance, their tongues bitten still during a harsher time so that we could fight another day. On that warm summer afternoon, Chinese Americans actually outnumbered tourists on Grant Avenue. It was the only moment of that tumultuous time that I felt we were one community, one village, united by our common craving for full acceptance in America. I really hope this day's march would swing them openly to our point of view, transforming the 6 companies from the grassroots up. Maybe we could work things out. The Waching youth and the Lee Wage youth could be trained for real jobs. DO leadership might accept a new vision, maybe even ask my reformist friends to join their councils. We continued our march past Empress of China building, Grant Avenue's tallest with its bay views, and then past the souvenir shops where I had worked my summer since the age of 10, China Bazaar, the Empress, where my old boss, Auntie Frances Wong, smiled and waved at me, past the Sun Sing Theater, where as a child I had lost myself in Cantonese movies, and finally we turned at the corner of Jackson Street, dominated by Lun Hing Supermarket, the only Chinese-owned supermarket, and the Italian market, where Mother bought her live turtles, live chickens, and live fish. Chanting as we march, we exercise the power of our voices, urging our community to reclaim its own voice and its rightful place in America. So do you think the 6 companies turned around and said, gee, this is great, we should all get together and change things? How many of you think they did? How many of you think they didn't? Let's see a show of hands. Okay, I think you guys are right, because late that summer we discovered that a contract had been placed with hitmen from New York's Chinatown, targeting 4 of our leaders, Mason Wong, George Wu, Alice Barkley, and Larry Jack Wong. By chance, an alert security guard at San Francisco International Airport detained the triggermen after puzzling over their sharply tailored pinstripe double-breasted suits, so unlike those of the drably dressed local Chinese Americans. The guard uncovered guns in their luggage and then alerted the police department to their final destination, San Francisco Chinatown. My reformist friends had survived, at least for the time being. And so it fell apart. There was no rapprochement. And so you have all these people running around. What did they do? Well, a few months later, during the Chinese New Year celebration, which is a pretty major celebration, this is what they did. That Chinese New Year, the year of the ram, the seething youth rebellion spilled out into the streets in an attempt to gut the community's biggest model minority public relations event, our annual 2-week-long celebration. Leeways and Waching youth alike taunted and harassed tourists along Grant Avenue. Random fistfights increased as the days ticked down to the grand finale, the Saturday night Chinese New Year parade. America's largest night-lit parade in prime time on Grant Avenue. I witnessed scores of fights up and down the parade route, climaxing in a shooting battle as retreating youth taking positions on the balcony ramparts of older housing projects, the Pingyuns, pinned down policemen with rifle fire, mere yards away from festive Grant Avenue. The leveler heads of the Piccolo's Cafe activists had not worn out. The intolerant ones now set the tone. And the price of change was rising across the board, as I discovered when Mason Wong, as part of an outreach, invited me to San Francisco State to observe a student strike and noon rally for an ethnic studies college. At high noon, we marched out into the student commons, the quad, with upraised fists defiantly yelling, "Power to the people." And that was when the games began, as the San Francisco Police Tactical Squad systematically isolated and beat to a bloody pulp the heads of as many leaders at the Black Student Union as they could corner. I watched them swing their long standard issue black hardwood clubs, reinforced in the center with steel pellets, up and down from right to left without restraint, as they chased down leader after leader. I had just sat in Ecumenical House only an hour ago with many of these now so seriously injured. There were few things to my youthful eyes so violently graphic as the sight of blood pouring down like a thick red waterfall against the blackness of crushed afros, agonized black faces, and the torn black leather jackets of the unarmed. That infamous day was later remembered as Bloody Tuesday. Yet that strike and a similarly violent one at UC Berkeley was settled in 1969 with the establishment of ethnic studies programs at both campuses. And so that was kind of the time that I came of age, and I actually call that section initiations, because looking back, there was a whole series of challenges and decisions that we had to make. And one of them, of course, was deciding, there was a draft whether we would go to Vietnam and fight what many of us felt was an unjust war. Thankfully, we ended that war before I had to face that question. Anyway, so when I started writing this book, I thought, well, yeah, it would be a memoir. I kind of lived through some exciting times, and maybe there's some lessons. And let me interview Mom and just get a little background of the old country. But the more I interviewed her, I realized that she had come from a way of life 1,000 years in the same village. And there had been so much wisdom from living together communally and being self-reliant and following the cycles of nature. And I did about 30-something hours in Toisanese, because she doesn't speak English to this day. And I tried to find a motto to include her. I didn't want to write about it. I didn't want to say I knew this stuff, because it kind of felt like an appropriation if I were to do that. And there were two books that really helped. The first was The Color of Water by James Mcbride. James Mcbride is an African-American who was a journalist of the Washington Post and now a jazz musician. Whose mother was white Jewish, and for some reason she completely stayed away from the Jewish community and chose to live only in the black community, and in fact became an ardent member of many black churches. He interviewed her later in life, and in a fascinating memoir, he placed her voice in every other chapter, and I went, maybe that's the way I should do it. I saw another book called In My Mother's House by Kim Chernin. And she also did the same. And when I read it, and I know Kim, and I talked to her about how she developed the voice and all of that, I decided this is how I'm going to write my book. So I'm going to give you a little taste of my mother's voice. The other thing I realized is that, you know, I was born and raised here, and I think many of us feel like we just started here, and that's what it's all about. You know, we just go on. We're American. We're Faux Tilt Boogie to college, to Google, to, in my case, Bank of America when I got out of school. And a lot of times we don't remember where our parents may have been from. We're a nation of immigrants. We're all from somewhere, or we're all from the Midwest, you know, some farm background. And what I discovered was the kind of ways of being, of treatment of people that my mother represented actually transferred to me in a quiet way, not a finger wagging, you got to learn this kind of way. And that these are the things that really took me through a lot of tumultuous times. One of the things I talk about in the book was when I went to Berkeley and this whole thing fell apart, some of the organized crime elements in the community recruited these kids to be their thugs. And we have an era that we commonly known as the Chinatown gang wars, and it really wasn't. It was more a political struggle where these kids were used, and then the cover-up was to throw it on kids, including rebels like my brother and Joe Fong and others who were framed. And in that process, that excruciating process of seeing this happen, figuring it out, and then fighting it in the court system and publicly, I found that it was my mother's quiet ways and the wisdom and that sense of balance and connection to an old tradition that kept me sane and sound. And so when I read this to you, it's not so much a socio-anthropological Shangri-La of time before we came to America, but I actually found a lot of use. So let me just give you a taste of this right now. Chapter 2, Ancestral Home, in my mother's voice. I was born on May 26, 1928. My parents named me Poy Jen. My name means one who deflects negative events and generates positive outcomes. It means that when misfortune dislodges our family, I am the one who returns us to the center and keeps us centered. I am a direct descendant of the first families who settled in our village 1,000 years ago. Suiwan is the name of our village, and it's a thriving village to this day. We still have a house there. It has sat empty for 50 years, awaiting our family's return. We are a Chun clan family, and so my maiden name is Chun. Your father was born and raised in a nearby Lee clan village before he left for America at the age of 13. Years later, he came back to marry me. We were farmers, and we came from somewhere else in northern China about 1,000 years ago. We are people of the Tang dynasty. That's why we still call ourselves Tongyan, or as we say in Toisanese, Hong Ngin. That is, people of the Tang. Our soil was Hausak, rich and wet, for Toisan is in the Pearl River Delta. Water so shiny you have to squint to see it. Our village faced a large paddy where we grew rice and other crops for market. All of us helped with farming, even the kids. Together, we prepared the fields, fixed the mud walls, planted, fertilized, and harvested. Every family raised their own vegetables in their private garden patch. Cabbage, scallions, bok choy, mustard greens, lettuce, so many vegetables. Fruit trees grew in yards throughout the village, for the weather was hot and moist for most of the year. Oh, so many kinds of fruit trees, red apples, bananas, plums, peaches. Our hills were full of trees that we used for building houses, wheelbarrows, plows, and furniture. Chickens and ducks ran freely through the village, gawk, 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 pecking away at this and that. One thing about my mom, when she talks with a soundtrack. So like if she says, he went up the stairs, she'll go bang, bang, bang. Or, oh, he got in the car and he just sped away, boom, zoom, you know. So that kind of helped a lot in developing the voice to make it distinct from mine. There were other techniques I had to use, because Toisan is a shorter, more concise sentence structure kind of language, so a lot of her wording is more like that. Life was not easy in the village like it is in America. Farmers worked constantly, sweating and breathing hard, worried all the time about enough rain and sun, daily checking for insects and rats that ate our crops. Our clothes were passed over and used until they fell completely apart. But still, we had lots more time to relax, to chat with one another, and to play. Once everything was done, it was done. You can't make the crops grow any faster by acting busy. Life was simpler in the village that way, and safer, that is, until the Japanese army attacked us. And so I chronicle in the next chapter the butterflies of death, that first encounter with technology in this village that had essentially been alone for about 1,000 years. I also wanted to read a bit about some of the things that I learned of the qi soups. Everybody knows what qi is, right? That's that kind of life force that people talk about in Asian culture, and it's kind of all around. Our people made soups out of herbs, and it was to kind of reinforce the energy of the body. And also, when the seasons change, you become more vulnerable, and so the qi soups would adjust the energy, so when the cold wind came down, you wouldn't catch cold so fast. And what I did was I asked my mom to really break down for me what each of these soups are made of, you know, and some of them sound pretty gross, like cow brain soup or oxtail or even turtle, or, you know, wood ear fungus, you know, things like that. And the reason I used the word qi was that I realized that if I could put it in a frame that people could understand, they could be receptive to reading about it without being grossed out or tuned out. And that seems to have happened. But one of the most remarkable things was after a woman has a baby, they isolate her for 30 days and they feed her different soups. The first week's soup is to get rid of the rest of the menses. The second week's soup is to make the milk nutritious and sweet so the baby would drink it. And then the rest of the regimen is basically to rebuild the woman's energy inside and the outer energy body, because labor tears everything up. And I thought that was amazing. And I thought about, well, you know, in our society nowadays, it's kind of, let's schedule the birth, and if it doesn't happen, we do a C-section, and oh, 2 or 3 days she's back at work at Google. And there isn't this kind of care and understanding of what happens to the body. And of course that has implications for our medical system. So that's what I mean when I started to interview her and I found out these things. I said, you know, there's a lot of wisdom here, and it could be very useful for us to understand how we're living our lives. And by the end of the book, what happens is that I kind of put that together with the way I live, and I think I've reached a kind of a middle place where I think that I'm a happier person, and I think that's perhaps what motivated me to kind of write this book. The other thing that that I discovered, which I found useful as a lawyer and as an international banker, when I worked for Bank of America for 7 years, was that my mom talks about speaking round and round. There was a way they had of resolving disputes in the village because they didn't really have courts, they didn't have sheriffs, they were self-reliant, and they had to work things out. Because if there was an emergency, everybody had to come. I couldn't hang back because I'm pissed at you. You know, I mean, we had to like fix this stuff personally so we could act. And so she had something called speaking round and round, and as she said, it wasn't like ji-ji-ja-ja, which is like talking, just gossip. There's a lot of onomatopoeia in Toisan language. And I witnessed this. People would get together, and then someone would say, this is a problem. And then the energy would change, and it would move from the daily socializing to what we call more of a numinous space. And suddenly people would be talking truth about the situation, about the parties involved, about the problem, and then it would shift into a solution. And people would suggest solutions, and then eventually the older ones always would pull these ideas together and say, okay, this is the solution. Now you go do this, you go do that, and we'll come back in a week or a day and see where we're at. And so they used this way of resolving things. So they didn't have courts, they didn't have arbitration, they just worked it out. And if something happened, bandits are coming, the levee broke, the Japanese army's invading, everybody just responded and helped each other. And I found as a lawyer, I was trained to, of course, be a litigator. And in a way, it kind of didn't work for me. And I think because of the way my mother was, she sort of taught in me more the energy of working things out. And so when I was working for Bank of America, they often would send me overseas because I could work things out that other people couldn't. I went to Saudi Arabia, and I went to all over South America, even though I didn't speak Spanish because there was a big currency devaluation. I worked on things in Asia. And so I want to read to you how some of this old wisdom actually came in handy in today's modern time. As Chief Legal Officer and Vice President for one of Bank of America's international subs, I discovered that my multicultural personality helped me succeed in countries where my American colleagues had hit an impasse. My counterparts, whether Saudi Arabian, Yemeni, European, South American, Singaporean, Japanese, or Chinese, detected my openness to them and my sincere interest in their culture. I went against the fault-finding grain of my legal training, respectfully probing into the human reasons why a historically good customer would default. In doing so, I inadvertently created speaking round and rounds. Once the other party recognized that I wasn't out to get him, but instead was seeking to work things out, he and his lawyer started to parcel out the important facts, express the most urgent concerns, just like in a speaking round and round. We could then take turns suggesting solutions and fashion one together. As it turned out, most of the thoughts were necessitated by unanticipated business exigencies. Our financially troubled clients had treated our loans as a temporary situation until they got back on their feet. Just as my mother did not see many of the kids that came to our house as a thief or as a coin taker, but understood their basic human goodness and little boy need for potato chips and so on, so too did I search for the human necessity implicit in each situation. The power of my improvised speaking round and round was not hampered by differences in language. It seemed that if I could create the right atmosphere, a kind of vibration or spell of resolution, the process worked out on its own. In one meeting in Paraguay held entirely in Spanish, a language I did not understand, I was somehow able to interject timely comments in American, advancing to speaking to its resolution stage. Afterwards, the other side remarked incredulously that it had followed along like a native speaker. And in Saudi Arabia, despite the differences, I discovered a Sharia concept of the amana, a concept not dissimilar to the Toisanese concept of community trust, which depends upon trusting one another's word, honesty, and cooperation for communal survival. And when I discovered this, I was able to kind of reach out and take a debt that probably would have never gotten money back on and elevated it to a trust debt, which is a priority, as you know, in bankruptcy systems. So anyway, so this sort of gives you an idea of the arc of the book, the voices, and also how I discovered that old ways are not just old ways, but there's wisdom. If you can somehow look at it and bring it into who we are as professionals and the way we live our personal lives are actually quite valuable. Well, thank you for coming. Any questions? Don't be shy.
People here.
Yeah.
If you do a Google search on Toisanese or Toisan, you don't get a lot of hits. In fact, the first couple of hits are probably references to you in your book.
Good. Thank you, Google.
Given that
Yeah.
a lot of people have immigrated from China
Yes.
In the past century or two,
Yes.
and that a large percentage of those
Originally
in
we're
the
from
20th century were from that area of southern China
Right.
and Toisan, but there's very little reference to it. If you tell people that you speak Toisan dialect, rather they don't know what that is.
Well, there's a reason for it. The majority dialect in China is Mandarin, right? And then in the south you have Cantonese. And then Toisan was a country variant of that. So in that way, it's a very rare dialect, like Cajun, if you know, or the Basque language, which is in the Pyrenees. So we're, in essence, a kind of a marginalized group linguistically. And also, because we're a country, we're actually looked down upon by people in Canton and Hong Kong. And so there's this element of, it's better not to say you're Toisan. So I think that all these things operate to make us either hide it or not owe up to it. What I do in the book is I actually explore the linguistic basis of Toisanese. And what I found was that language came from growing up in land, growing up farming and needing to speak over long distances. That's why our normal level is at a shout. You know, when you go on the buses with these old women, it seems like they're shouting at each other. Why? Because when you live and farm and there's no cell phone, there's not even megaphones, that's how you talk. And it becomes part of you. But some of the roughness of the language, I think, has to do with that, because when the language is rough, when you say it, it goes over longer distances and there's barbs to it that you can hear. And especially when there's danger, like your child is sick, or bandits or the Japanese are invading, or there's a house on fire, that communication has to work. So when I looked at that, I said, oh, there's a reason why this language is like that. It's not like we just deliberately made an ugly language so everybody would hate us or look down on us. And so when I looked at that, I also saw that that was the characteristics of our people, which are we're direct, you know, we're a pretty tough people. We get things done and we're persistent. And so there's a correlation between the language and our character and our experience. And so when I examined it that way, it didn't seem like such a bad thing. Now, in terms of Toisanese, it is a rare dialect. China has a problem of having thousands of dialects, literally, and so that's why they try to standardize. Is it a dying language? I don't think so, because when I was in Hoi Sin in 2000, not only had that town grew by 10, but there were a lot of kids still speaking Toisanese. It's just a kind of a rare phenomenon. You know, it's like if you're from Louisiana and you speak Cajun, right? Well, you speak with each other, but when you go to the big cities, you have to speak regular English. Or if you're Hawaiian, you might speak Hawaiian. It's a beautiful language. It's another language that's close to the land, the breezes, the birds. But when they go to work for Google or for some resort hotel, their English has to be down. So does that kind of answer your question to some extent?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I think probably a little bit more why there isn't more of it in the literature.
Well, you know, I think because we were farm people. You know, but the interesting thing is, if we are from the Tang Dynasty, so when you hear the poetry of the Tang Dynasty, it doesn't sound as good and it doesn't rhyme that well in Mandarin. But when you hear it in Cantonese or Toisan, it actually hits right, the tones, the pronunciations. So in a sense, if you were to go back 1,000 years before whatever royal family wing lost and had to flee for their lives to Toisan, there is a literature of Toisan, but it's from the Tang Dynasty. But that connect hasn't been made yet, and it hasn't been popularized. But I think maybe that's the next level. I mean, this is not just a legend, but as you know, a lot of people in China, they keep these genealogical books, and every, you know, kind of like some people in their Bible pick who was born and to whom. Some of these go back 2,000 years, and there's quite a few of them that trace back to the Tang Dynasty. So maybe that's the connect that needs to be made. I've noticed there is a growth of some Toisan sites from China. Facebook, there's a Toisan group that just contacted me and I joined. There's like 250 people on it. You might want to check that out. It's more ABCs, or American-born Chinese. So, any other questions? Yeah.
So I was curious how your mom felt about being so front and center in this book and being very...
My mom is very loving, and the 8th promise, in fact, she made 8 promises when she left China, but the 8th one is of compassion and of really caring for her children, and then spreading that to everyone you meet along the path of life. She was totally supportive. She doesn't understand me, you know. She's this, you know, lawyer guy, goes off to write a book instead of making money, right? Still not married, lives with people, but still not married, you know, blah, blah, blah. But she's accepted me, and initially she was totally cooperative. But when I wrote the book and we started going out reading, well, one of the things I explore is actually a polyamorous relationship my mom had with another man in her life, which was accepted by my dad, because my dad was, you know, a provider, but he wasn't really emotionally always there for her, and she needed that. So there was a guy that was, as she put it, the love of her life and my father's best friend. When I put that out, and she told me about it, because I didn't make this up, she said, why did you tell this in your book? You know, you get all those books back and take it out. I said, Mom, there's like thousands of copies all over America. It's not like, you know, delete, cut and paste. I can't do that. So she was a little pissed at me, although when she told me about it, she knew it was going into a book. But what changed was that as we started to go to more community events, people would come up to her and say, you know, your honesty about what happened with your husband and the relationship really helped me, because, you know, we had similar situations, and it's just so rare to hear a Chinatown woman say this stuff. So then she saw, oh, this is helping people, you know, and because she's a compassionate person. She said, well, then it's okay, I'm okay with it. And so suddenly we could hang and it wasn't an issue anymore. So there were 2 reactions. One was supporting, and then the facts came out and went, oh my God. And then later, oh, it's helping people. Well, I'm down with it. So that sort of has happened. Yes?
I have a lot of Vietnamese friends.
Yes.
Their parents, they suffered to the Vietnamese war.
Yes.
And, but the kids, my friends, they don't seem to care or even bother searching what the parents they had to go through, and then they don't, in my eyes, they don't appreciate anything
their culture, yeah.
And, but do you think that new generation is like they don't appreciate enough, or they don't understand, or is something that the parents did that was missing, that they spoiled them too much?
Well, you know, it's 2 reactions. You know, I was born here, but I was raised by my mother, who was old country, and so my first language, since I spent 24/7 with her, was Chinese, and I didn't even start learning American until I went to kindergarten. What I have to say is that when you try to assimilate from another culture, it's kind of a full-time job. You know, you really have to get the language down. You have to learn simple things like using a knife or fork at some point, which is second nature to a lot of people. And in my, you know, then you have to know the latest dance moves and who's the hot hits. So this is a full-time gig. So I think what happens a lot of time is that immigrant kids are focused, as they should be, on making it in America. But what I hope is that later, as I did, because I went through that experience, that they will look back and they will say, I wonder who my mother is. I wonder what they went through, you know? So I think there's a time when you come back to it, and maybe they're still too young to do that. What shocks me about it, if there's no interest, is that in this day and age, when plurality and diversity are sort of acceptable, as opposed to my age when it was just a simulation, that there isn't more interest. I'm wondering whether some of it is because the horrors of what they went through because of the war, or if they were boat people and had to go out in the South China Seas, that's something even their family doesn't want to talk about. And so it's kind of a closed book in general. They're just glad to be here, to be able to start a new life, and let's make it work. So I don't know, I'd have to know more about them. Does that make sense to you?
Well,
Yeah.
maybe like later they'll want to.
Yeah, and especially when you get a little older and you've got some travel money and, you know, you can go, it's easy to go back to Vietnam now. They might get curious. I met a young man at Berkeley. I spoke there last week at a literature class, and he didn't really care much about his background, but he went back and he said, you know, I sat in Saigon and I found a simple stand. This guy just makes like Vietnamese coffee, you know, that thick milk stuff, and he makes little edis like tapas. And he said every day I would sit there for 2-3 hours, and my grandmother thought I was crazy, like, why are you there? And he said, but what was happening was that I was finding myself, my emotional space, my connection to the land and the people. I mean, nobody was teaching him anything, nobody was giving him lessons in culture, but just by being in the space of his ancestors, he was being fed in his soul and in his spirit. And so I think that's something we can all benefit from. In fact, I talk about the first time I went back to my village, and I basically had a mystical experience. I just felt completely right. And when I thought about it, it's because our people have lived there 1,000 years. So everything we've eaten that have made us is from this land, literally. And so that land and me are probably energetically more in tune than any other piece of earth I can walk on in this world. I felt that I had hit the tuning fork of my body, of my spirit, and I just had this burst of energy, and it came through like Kundalini, and boom, and I was just like in hilarity and just chuckling for days. You know, it was amazing. It was a really amazing experience. And I think that's what can happen if you're from a people that have been in a place a long time and you go back to that place where they're from, if you can find it, that can happen. I've had Italian Americans talk about that because many of them are from places like Umbria where they've lived for hundreds of years. Irish, of course, they often can say, we're from this county and we've been here for, you know, a long time. So this is not a unique experience. It can happen to anybody. Any other questions? Yes, Ariel.
Is there a story of maybe your book going back to Toisan and the reaction of has it been translated?
Actually, that's
good back there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've actually lectured on this book in Beijing and in Shanghai, and in fact, last year I was at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and I gave over 3 weeks lectures. They like the book for a number of reasons. First of all, they do like the Jimi Hendrix stuff, and they do like the civil rights stuff because that's very interesting to them. And they like hearing it from a Chinese Americans because they feel there may be an overlap of sensibility that makes them feel like they're closer to the action than if they read, say, H. Rap Brown's description of it, or a white leftist description of what happened. But it's being translated into Chinese. And the interesting about it, it's actually being translated by mainland Chinese in Beijing, a book written by an overseas Chinese, but it's going to be published by a Taiwan publishing house. So it's kind of a symbolic of the way China is growing and remembering itself in its different ways. I have not been to the South with this, and partly that's due to serendipity, but some friends of mine are going to start sending it to professors in Guangzhou, which is the main city in Guangdong. And there's some interest in English reading Chinese in Singapore and Malaysia for this, either this version or a right to publish it in their country. So yeah, it's kind of spreading. And it's very exciting. So, any other questions? Yes?
I just wanted to know if you're writing this memoir brought forth any additional reexamination of your brother's
In terms of the legal situation, yeah, Julie asked whether writing the memoir has forced a re-examination of the legal case. I think that's a decision my brother has to make, and he did his time, and he was released on good behavior, and he kind of wants to forget about it. He's started a life. He's got, he's married with 2 daughters in their teen years, going to private school. His mortgage is paid off. He's got a family dog and 2 minivans. So in my view, he's disgustingly middle class, but considering where he's been, I understand that this is a good thing. I personally wish he'd get more involved in like Innocence Project and other things like that, but I didn't do 13 years in prison. I don't know what that does to a man and what you have to suppress or heal to function, so I don't ask him to do that. So I've actually asked him, do you want to do more about this case? And his clear answer is no, I did it, it's behind me, it's not holding me back, I don't want to revisit it. So yeah, so that's kind of where he's at. Any other questions? Well, great. Thank you all for coming. If you have a copy of a book you'd like me to sign, I'll be right over here. And that's it. Thank you.